All right, let's get into one of the most unbelievable survival stories in the entire history of science. This is the story of Anatoly Bugorski, a man who literally put his head inside a particle accelerator and somehow lived to talk about it. Those were his words. Not to describe some explosion, but the flash of light he saw inside his own head. He said he didn't feel any pain, just this impossibly bright light, as a beam of protons going nearly the speed of light shot straight through his brain. I mean, it's a question that sounds like it belongs in a superhero origin story, right? But for Anatoly Bugorski, this became a terrifying reality. It turned him into a living, breathing case study for a question science absolutely never wanted to answer with a real person. It all happened on July 13th, 1978. And it started with a single, completely silent flash. So Bugorski was a physicist at the Soviet Union's Institute for High Energy Physics, and he was working on their big gun, the U-70 synchrotron. He was checking on some equipment that wasn't working right, and he leaned into the machine. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that several safety locks had all failed at once, putting his head directly in the path of the proton beam. Now that beam was packing some serious heat, 76 giga-electron volts. To put that into perspective for you, that is a massive amount of energy, way, way more than you'd ever see in medical radiation, and it was all focused into this tiny stream of protons, and it was fired point blank into a skull. But the truly mind-blowing number here is the radiation dose. Okay, so a Roentgen is just a way to measure radiation. A dose of about 500 Roentgens is pretty much always fatal. Bugorski absorbed, get this, up to 300,000 Roentgens. That is hundreds of times the lethal dose, all in a fraction of a second. And this diagram, wow, it shows the terrifying path that beam took. It went in through the back of his skull, burned right through the parts of his brain that handle vision and sound, passed through his middle ear, and then blasted out right next to his nose. So who was the man at the center of this completely unprecedented accident? You know, it's important to remember he wasn't just some statistic in a lab report. He was a real guy, a dedicated scientist, a husband, a father. He was working at the absolute cutting edge of Soviet physics on their most powerful machine. He knew the work had risks, sure, but nobody could have ever predicted something like this. Now, here's where the story gets even crazier. After seeing that flash of light, Bugorski just finished his work for the day. He didn't tell a soul. He figured it was impossible he could have actually been hit. But the aftermath, it was fast and it was horrifying. Within just a few hours, the effects started showing up. The left side of his face, where the beam had exited, just blew up. It swelled to a point where you couldn't even recognize him. Then, over the next couple of days, the skin began to peel away. The doctors who took him to a special clinic in Moscow could literally see the burn channel, the path the beam took through his face, through the bone of his skull and right into the brain tissue itself. They'd never seen anything remotely like it. They were absolutely certain he was going to die within days. Their only job was to observe and document it. But then, the most unbelievable part of this entire story happened. Anatoly Bugorski did not die. I mean, just look at the difference between what everyone expected and what actually happened. The doctors saw certain death. He survived. They predicted that even if he lived, he'd be totally incapacitated. Instead, the man went on to finish his PhD. They assumed his brain would be fried, that his intellect would be gone, but it stayed remarkably intact, although he did suffer from some serious mental fatigue. But surviving something like this isn't free. It came with a heavy, lifelong price. The beam basically cooked the nerves along its path. He completely lost hearing in his left ear, and it was replaced with this constant, maddening ringing sound. The left side of his face was permanently paralyzed, and for the rest of his life, he suffered from these awful, debilitating seizures. And then there was this one truly bizarre side effect, something straight out of science fiction. Because all the nerves on the left side of his face were dead, that side of his face was essentially frozen in time. So as he got older, the right side of his face got wrinkles, but the left side stayed perfectly smooth, like a permanent mask of his younger self. His survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a whole new chapter, one that was defined by government secrecy and this really strange kind of fame in a very, very small circle. Because the Soviet Union was so secretive about anything nuclear, his story was classified for more than a decade. But inside the medical world, he became a legend. He was like a living exhibit, the guy they would bring out to show other victims of nuclear accidents that, hey, It was possible to survive the unsurvivable. This timeline really shows you just how long they forced him to be quiet. The accident was in '78, but it wasn't until the late '80s that he could finally tell his story. And even then, he had to fight. Can you believe that in 1996, years after the Soviet Union fell, he was actually denied the disability status that would have gotten him free medication for his constant seizures? And here it is, maybe the most astonishing detail of all. Anatoli Bugorski went back to work. He didn't just go back to being a physicist, he eventually became the coordinator of experiments at the same institute, working with the very same machine that almost vaporized him. So how do you even wrap your head around a story like this? His survival is still a medical mystery. Maybe it's because the beam was so focused that it just killed the cells instantly instead of causing the widespread damage you see with lower-level radiation. He's this incredible example of human resilience. But he's also a man who's lived for decades with paralysis, with seizures, with all these invisible wounds from that one day. So what is it? A medical miracle or a lifelong curse? In the end, his story is just this stark, chilling reminder of the terrifying power we've learned to control and the unbelievably thin line between life and death.